The envelope arrived 11 days before the world ended. Not in the mail. My grandfather placed it in my hands himself, sitting in his wheelchair on the porch of the Veterans Affairs Hospice in Beckley, West Virginia, with an oxygen line taped under his nose and the Blue Ridge behind him going amber in October light. His fingers were cold and precise. He didn't shake. 81 years old, lungs full of coal dust and Agent Orange residue. And his hands were steadier than mine. "Elise," he said, "don't open this here." I took the envelope, legal-sized manila, sealed with packing tape like he expected someone to try steaming it. My name written on the front in his draftsman's handwriting, the kind they used to teach in vocational schools before computers replaced the need for a man to letter clearly. "When do I open it?" I asked. "When something happens and you can't call anyone." I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because that was the kind of thing he'd always said. He was the man who kept a hand-crank radio in his truck, and 2 weeks of water in a cellar he dug himself under a house he no longer owned. He'd been warning me about fragility since I was 9. Infrastructure is a promise, Elise. Promises break. I put the envelope in my glove compartment and drove 2 hours back to my apartment in Charleston. I worked the front desk at a Holiday Inn Express. I had a cat named Diesel and a savings account with $1,100 in it. I was 26 years old, and I had not, at any point in my life, been essential to any system, any person, or any plan. I had a communications degree I'd never used. I had a face people found approachable and forgot immediately after. If you'd asked anyone who knew me to describe a single distinguishing skill I possessed, they would have been generous and vague. My grandfather was the only person who had ever looked at me as though I contained something specific. He died 4 days later. Pulmonary fibrosis. The hospice called at 6 in the morning, and I sat on the edge of my bed and cried for 40 minutes. Then I drove to Beckley and signed papers, and chose cremation because he'd told me to, and drove home and fed the cat, and went to work at 3 for the evening shift. A woman from Michigan complained about the pool temperature. I adjusted it. I smiled the way you smile when you work a desk. No one noticed anything. No one was supposed to. 6 days after that, I woke up to silence. Not ordinary silence. The silence of systems not running. No hum from the refrigerator. No traffic on Washington Street. I checked my phone. No signal. I turned on the faucet and got a thin brown line that coughed twice and stopped. I walked to the window and looked down at the street from my 3rd-floor unit. A car was sideways across the intersection at Court and Summers, both doors open. There was something on the sidewalk near the library that I initially processed as a coat. It was not a coat. I stood there for perhaps 3 minutes, trying to decide what I was seeing. Then a woman came around the corner of the library at a dead sprint, barefoot, holding a child against her chest. And behind her came 2 men, who were not running like men. They moved with a stiffness that looked mechanical, until one of them caught the curb wrong and didn't fall. His ankle folded sideways, and he continued forward on it without altering his gait. The sound that came from his throat reached my closed window as a vibration I felt in my sternum. The woman made it to a door. I don't know whose. She got inside. The 2 figures stood outside that door for 11 minutes. I counted. They didn't try the handle. They didn't leave. They stood with their faces close to the seam between door and frame, like dogs reading scent. I backed away from the window. I sat on my kitchen floor with Diesel pressing his head into my thigh. I thought about the envelope. It was still in my glove compartment. My car was in the parking structure. The parking structure opened onto the street. I waited until the 2 figures moved. It took another 40 minutes. They drifted west on Court Street, following something I couldn't see, their heads tracking in tandem like birds, responding to the same signal. When they turned the corner and disappeared behind the Kanawha County parking garage, I put on my boots. I want to be precise about what I took with me because it matters. I took my phone, which was useless. I took my keys. I took Diesel's carrier. And I took Diesel because I was not yet the kind of person who could make calculations about weight and speed and survival probability. I was a woman going to her car. That's all I understood. The stairwell was empty. The lobby was empty. The glass front door was intact. I could see the parking structure entrance across a 40-foot stretch of open lot. There was nothing between me and the door except daylight and the absolute absence of any living person. I crossed it in 9 seconds, carrying a 12-pound cat in a plastic crate, and I have never felt more visible in my life. The parking structure was concrete and dim and smelled like transmission fluid and something else. Something wet and organic. I found my car on the second level. I opened the glove compartment before I started the engine. The envelope was where I'd left it. I tore it open with my teeth. Inside, a folded topographic map, hand annotated. USGS quad sheet, Pocahontas County, the kind my grandfather collected the way other men collected stamps. His handwriting covered it in blue ballpoint. Route numbers circled, elevation lines traced in red. A single destination marked with a precise X, labeled in his block letters. Site 7. Below the map, a single sheet of notebook paper. His handwriting again, undated. Elise, if you're reading this, the phones are probably out. Don't go to any government shelter. Don't go to any church. Don't go to any school. Don't go anywhere. People are told to gather. Go where I'm sending you. Road is marked. Total distance from Charleston, 114 miles. Take 60 east to 219 north. Watch for the cedar post I described below. You can make it in one tank. The shelter is stocked for one person for 14 months. It is not on any map except this one. No one knows about it except you. I built it between 2004 and 2019. I'm sorry I could not tell you while I was alive, because you would have thought I was crazy and you would have been right. But I was right too. I love you more than I was able to say, and this is what I can give you instead of saying it. The combination is your mother's birthday backward. Go now. Don't stop for anyone. I read it twice. Then I started the car. The streets of Charleston were wrong in a way I couldn't fully catalog from behind a windshield. Doors open everywhere. A fire burning in a second-floor window of the Wells Fargo building with no one responding. A city bus stopped diagonally across Kanawha Boulevard, with its emergency flashers still cycling, all doors wide. I saw 3 more of the figures. 2 standing in the median of Virginia Street, motionless, facing the same direction. 1 sitting on the steps of a church with its jaw working open and closed in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the speech. I took Corridor G to Route 60 East. The traffic thinned within 10 minutes. By the time I reached the Gauley Bridge Junction, I was alone on the road. Just me, the cat, and the mountains opening around me, in that way they do when you leave the Kanawha Valley heading east. The ridgeline stepping up like the walls of something you were always inside of but never noticed. I drove the speed limit. I don't know why. Some part of my brain was still following rules made for a world that had existed yesterday. I stopped at a red light in Raynell before I realized what I was doing. The intersection was empty. The gas station on the corner had its pumps dark. A hand-lettered sign in the window of the Dollar General read, "Closed, God help us." Diesel meowed once, low and sustained, like a question. "I don't know," I told him. I turned north on 219. The road narrowed. The mountains closed in. My grandfather's map lay on the passenger seat, his handwriting steady and deliberate, every annotation made in the voice I could hear if I let myself. He'd drawn small arrows at every turn. He'd noted mileage between landmarks. He'd written, at the junction where 219 crosses the Greenbrier River, bridge may be blocked. If so, ford at the gravel bar 200 yards south. Water is shin-deep in October. Do not attempt in spring. It was October. He'd known even that, or he'd planned for it. Or the distinction didn't matter because the result was the same. He had anticipated me on this road, in this season, with no one to call. He had built a path calibrated to my exact helplessness. And either that was love, or it was something else I didn't have a word for yet. The bridge was not blocked. I crossed the Greenbrier River on old concrete with the water running clear and shallow below. And for a quarter mile after that, I felt something close to relief. Then I came around a curve and found the road occupied. A pickup truck angled across both lanes, tailgate down, engine off. Behind it, a man and a woman standing with a child between them. The man held a rifle across his chest, not aimed, not lowered. The woman had her hand on the child's shoulder. They were looking at me. I stopped. 50 feet. The engine idled. Diesel shifted in his crate. The man walked toward me. He was maybe 50, heavy in the shoulders, wearing a blaze orange vest over a flannel shirt. His face was sunburned and strained. He stopped 10 feet from my hood and raised one hand, palm out. The rifle stayed across his body. "Road's closed," he said. "I'm just passing through." "Where to?" I hesitated. My grandfather's instructions were explicit. Don't stop for anyone. But the instruction didn't contain a protocol for an armed man asking a direct question on a 2-lane road with no alternative route. "North," I said. "I have family." "There's nothing north," the woman called from behind the truck. "We came from Durban. It's gone." "What do you mean, gone?" The man looked back at the woman, then at me. "Empty. Every house open. Found 3 bodies in the Food Lion parking lot, and they weren't all the way dead. You understand what I'm saying?" I understood. "I'm still going north." He studied me for a long moment. The child was maybe 7, a boy, holding a stuffed animal I couldn't identify at this distance. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the tree line behind me with an attention that seemed practiced. "You got supplies?" the man asked. "Some." "You got a weapon?" "No." He exhaled through his nose. Something changed in his posture. The rigidity softened into something I recognized from my grandfather's bearing when he'd made a decision he didn't want to explain. He walked back to the truck and pulled it forward onto the shoulder without speaking to me. The gap opened. The woman watched me as I drove through. The boy never looked at my car. I checked the mirror. They were already repositioning the truck. 9 miles farther north, I found the cedar post. It was exactly where the map said it would be, on the left shoulder where a logging road met the highway, weathered to gray, with a small notch cut at eye height. I would have driven past it 1,000 times without seeing it. My grandfather had seen it because he'd put it there. The logging road was steep, unpaved, overgrown to single-lane width. Branches scraped the roof. I drove for 2.4 miles, which is what the map said. And when the road dead-ended at a turnaround circle cut into the hillside, I stopped. There was nothing here. A hillside. Hardwood forest, mostly oak, the leaves just turning. A seasonal creek running clear over sandstone 10 yards to the left. Bird sound. Wind. I got out of the car and stood in the turnaround with the map in my hands. The X was here. I was standing on it. But there was no shelter, no structure, no door. My grandfather's final annotation, written below the X in smaller handwriting, read, "Face uphill. Walk to the split white oak. Stand between the trunks. Look down." I found the white oak. Its trunk divided at chest height into two main stems, each leaning slightly outward, creating a gap a person could stand in. I stood in it. I looked down. At my feet, covered by 6 inches of leaf litter and a deliberate layer of moss, was a steel plate 2 feet square, painted in a brown that matched the forest floor. A combination dial was recessed into its center, flush-mounted, with a hinged weather cover. My mother's birthday backward. I turned the dial. Something heavy moved beneath me with a sound like a bolt withdrawing from deep stone. The plate hinged upward on a counterbalanced arm, revealing a vertical shaft with a steel ladder descending into dim amber light. My grandfather had built a hole in a mountain and put a light in it and left me the only key. 15 years of work. Every weekend I thought he was fishing. Every trip to Pocahontas County I thought was about solitude. He was building this. For me. Against a day he believed was coming, with the certainty of a man who had seen systems fail before, in jungles and in hospitals, and in every institution that had promised him it would hold. I picked up Diesel's crate. I descended. The shaft went down 14 feet. The ladder was aluminum, bolted to a concrete sleeve, and at the bottom it opened into a space that stopped my breathing for a full 5 seconds. Not from fear, from recognition. From the sudden, violent understanding that I had been loved with a precision I never perceived, while the man who built this was alive to tell me what it meant. The shelter was a single rectangular room, roughly 12 by 20 feet, carved into sandstone and lined with poured concrete. The ceiling was 7 feet. The floor was sealed concrete with a slight pitch toward a drain in the far corner. The amber light came from a battery-powered LED strip running the ceiling's perimeter, activated, I would later determine, by a motion sensor at the base of the ladder. The air was cool and dry, pushed by a ventilation system I could hear as a low, steady whisper from 2 vents near the ceiling. Along the left wall, metal shelving units, floor to ceiling, loaded with supplies. Canned food organized by type and expiration date, rotated recently enough that nothing I checked had expired. Water in 5-gallon rigid containers, 28 of them, stacked 3 high. A water filtration system still in its packaging. Medical supplies in labeled bins, a hand crank radio, batteries organized by size in fishing tackle boxes, 2 LED lanterns, fire extinguisher, a camp stove with 12 fuel canisters, wool blankets, vacuum sealed, a sleeping bag rated to 15 below. Along the right wall, tools, a handsaw, a hatchet, or a full socket set, a cordless drill with 4 charged batteries in a sealed case, PVC pipe sections and fittings, wire, rope, duct tape, 14 rolls, which I would later learn is not excessive. A small library of field manuals in a waterproof bin, first aid, water purification, plant identification for the Central Appalachian region, radio operation, basic structural repair. At the far end, a composting toilet behind a plywood partition, a fold-down desk built into the wall, and above the desk, a corkboard. Pinned to the corkboard were 3 items. A photograph of me at 8 years old, sitting on his lap on the porch of the house in Beckley, both of us squinting into a July sun. A hand-drawn diagram of the ventilation system. And a second envelope, smaller, white, with my name on it. I set Diesel's crate on the floor and opened it. He stepped out with the cautious authority of a cat entering a room he intended to own. He smelled the air, circled once, and sat down on the sleeping bag, as though he'd been here before. I opened the second envelope. Elise. If you made it here, you did exactly what I knew you would do. You followed instructions. That is not a small thing. Most people, when they are frightened, cannot follow a sequence. You can. I have watched you do it your whole life. You think you are ordinary. You are wrong. You are the only person I trusted with this, not because you are the strongest or the smartest, but because you are the one who listens and then acts without needing to be convinced. That is the rarest thing in the world, and I could not make you believe it by telling you, so I'm showing you instead. This shelter will keep you alive for 14 months if you follow the protocols in the red binder on the second shelf. After 14 months, you will need to supplement from the surface. I have included instructions. There is one thing I could not build for you, and I need you to understand it now. This shelter is for one person. It will sustain one person on the caloric and water budget I calculated. Every person you add cuts the timeline. I am not telling you to refuse people. I am telling you to count. You must always know how many days you have. That number is your life. Do not let anyone convince you that sharing without counting is generosity. It is not. It is the way good people die. I love you. I'm sorry I was not easier to know. I built this instead. Grandpa. I sat at the fold-down desk and pressed both palms flat against it and cried. Not the way I'd cried when the hospice called. This was structural. Something inside me was rearranging itself around the new weight of what this man had done. 15 years. Weekends and savings and trips to a county where he had no friends and no history, hauling concrete and steel and canned goods up a logging road and into a mountain alone, in his 60s and then his 70s, while his lungs filled and his wife died, and his daughter, my mother, stopped returning his calls because she thought his warnings were symptoms. He'd built me a life, measured to the calorie, and he'd put my photograph on the wall, so the first thing I saw when I arrived was evidence that I had been the point. The red binder was where he said it would be. I opened it at the desk under the amber light with Diesel on my lap and the hatch sealed above me, and I entered the first hours of my new existence by reading my grandfather's handwriting like scripture. He had organized it into sections: water, food, air, waste, power, security, medical, communication. Each section opened with a calculation, followed by a procedure, followed by a contingency. His engineering mind laid bare on lined paper, every number checked, every assumption stated. He did not hide uncertainty. He marked it. Where data was insufficient, he wrote, estimated. Verify by day 30. The water calculation was the one that anchored everything. 28 containers at 5 gallons each, 140 gallons, at a strict ration of 1 gallon per day. Half for drinking, half for cooking and sanitation. That was 140 days. Supplemented by the filtration system drawing from the seasonal creek above, which ran reliably from September through May, he estimated 18 months of sustainable water access. In summer, when the creek reduced to a trickle, I would need to haul from the Greenbrier 3 miles downhill. He had noted the route and the estimated round-trip time. 4 hours with 2 5-gallon containers. The food calculation was more generous. He'd stocked for 14 months at 1,800 calories per day, which he described as maintenance, not comfort. The inventory list ran 3 pages. He'd included vitamin supplements, reasoning that canned food alone would produce deficiencies by month 4. He'd included salt, sugar, powdered milk, and coffee, the last of which he'd annotated, not essential. Included because you are my granddaughter and you will need it. I almost smiled. Almost. The security section was the shortest. The shelter's primary defense was invisibility. No one knew it existed. The hatch was designed to be indistinguishable from the forest floor when closed. The ventilation outlets were disguised as natural rock formations, 20 feet uphill. There was no external indication of human presence. His protocol was unambiguous. Do not go to the surface during daylight for the first 30 days. Do not make fire on the surface for the first 60 days. Do not make noise that carries beyond the tree line. Invisibility is your primary weapon and your only reliable one. Everything else is a gamble. He had not included a firearm. This was deliberate. Another annotation. A gun requires ammunition, maintenance, and the willingness to use it. I do not know if you have the third, and the first two are finite. A gun also changes how you think. It makes you believe you can control an encounter. You cannot. You can only avoid one. Avoid. I read the entire binder in 4 hours. When I finished, I understood 3 things. First, that my grandfather had thought about my survival, with more rigor than I'd ever applied to any aspect of my own life. Second, that the shelter was, within its parameters, nearly perfect. Third, that the parameters were exactly 1 person wide, and the world above me was full of people who would not fit. I turned off the LED strip and lay on the sleeping bag in total darkness. The ventilation whispered. Diesel settled against my hip. The mountain pressed around me on all sides. And for the first time in my life, I felt held by something that expected nothing in return. No desk to work, no shift to cover, no smile to perform. Just air, water, food, and the measured love of a dead man who believed I was worth all of it. I slept 12 hours. When I woke, I opened the hatch just far enough to check the sky, blue and empty. The forest was October still. No sound of vehicles, no sound of aircraft, no sound of anything human. I closed the hatch and went back to the binder. Page 1, start again. Count everything. I began the way he taught me, not by preparing for the worst, but by measuring what I had. Because the distance between those 2 actions is the difference between panic and survival. And he had known that. And now I knew it too. On the inside cover of the binder, he had written 1 more line, separate from the protocols, in handwriting slightly less steady than the rest, as though he'd added it later, maybe last. You are not hiding. You are waiting. There is a difference. Learn it. By day 4, I had memorized the inventory. By day 6, I had established the routine my grandfather's binder prescribed. Wake, check air system, check water reserves, eat, read, exercise in place for 30 minutes, eat again, sleep. A monastic schedule designed to minimize caloric expenditure and psychological deterioration. He'd thought about the second one, explicitly. A section titled Mental Health read, Isolation damages the mind faster than hunger damages the body. Maintain a schedule. Maintain hygiene. Talk aloud if necessary. Write if you can. Do not allow yourself to sleep more than 9 hours. Excessive sleep is not rest. It is withdrawal. I talked to Diesel. I talked to my grandfather, which is to say I talked to the corkboard where his photograph and mine hung side by side. I reported my daily counts as though he could hear them. Water, 136 gallons. Food, 418 days at 1,800 calories. Air system, nominal. Hatch integrity, sealed. And then I would add something personal, the way you'd leave a voicemail you knew no one would check. Today I found the instant coffee. You were right, I needed it. On day 7, I violated protocol for the first time. Not dramatically. I opened the hatch at dusk and sat on the edge of the shaft, with my legs dangling inside and my head just above ground level, watching the tree line go dark. I needed to see the sky. 4 days underground had produced a pressure behind my eyes that no amount of LED light could relieve. The forest was quiet, not dead quiet, living quiet, owls warming up in the hemlocks. A deer moving through the understory 50 yards east, its footfalls precise and unhurried. The creek running over sandstone with the particular sound water makes, when no one has touched the world around it. I sat there for 20 minutes. When I descended and sealed the hatch, my hands were shaking, but not from fear, from something closer to grief. The world was still there, still functioning in the way forests function. And the things that were wrong with it were confined, as far as I could tell, to wherever people had been. Day 9 broke the rhythm. I was running the morning ventilation check when I heard footsteps above the hatch. Not deer, not the casual arrhythmia of an animal browsing. A human cadence. 2 feet, steady, moving across the turnaround circle where I'd left my car. My car. I had left my car in the turnaround. I had not moved it. I had not concealed it. My grandfather's binder addressed vehicle management on page 43. If you drive to the site, you must move your vehicle within 24 hours. Drive it to the pull-off at mile marker 6 on 219 and walk back. A car at the dead end of a logging road is a sign that says someone is here. Remove it. I had read that page. I had noted it. I had not done it because moving the car required being outside, on a road, visible, for an hour-long round trip. And every hour of those first days, I had chosen the hatch instead. The footsteps stopped. I heard a hand brush the hood of my car. Then a voice, male, young, hoarse. Somebody's here. A second voice, female, farther away. Could be abandoned. Engine's cold, but the dust pattern's wrong. Someone drove this in the last week. Silence. I stood beneath the hatch with my hands against the steel plate, holding my breath, listening to 2 strangers deduce my existence from the evidence I'd been too careful to erase and too careless to conceal. Hello? The male voice called. Not loud, calibrated to carry through trees without carrying beyond them. A voice that understood what volume meant now. We're not armed. We're not sick. We just need water. I pressed my palms harder against the steel. My grandfather's instructions were explicit. Invisibility is your primary weapon. Avoid. But he'd also written, in the section on communication, a line I'd read 3 times without understanding. I am teaching you to survive, not to become someone who only survives. If you cannot tell the difference, the shelter has failed. I didn't open the hatch, not then. I stood beneath it for 6 minutes while the footsteps circled my car, moved to the creek, paused. And then the female voice said something I couldn't parse, and both sets of footsteps retreated down the logging road. I exhaled. My shirt was soaked through at the spine. I sat on the concrete floor and opened the binder to the water calculation and stared at the numbers like they could tell me whether I'd just done the right thing. 134 gallons, 1 person, 412 days of food at 1,800 calories. My grandfather had built this with arithmetic, and the arithmetic said 1. But the arithmetic didn't account for the sound of that voice. We just need water, not a demand, not a threat. A statement of biological fact delivered with the restraint of someone who understood that asking for water from a stranger in this new world was an act of extraordinary exposure. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the sleeping bag and listened to the mountain above me and thought about the man on the logging road standing next to my car, calculating dust patterns the way my grandfather calculated water. A person who noticed things. A person who was careful. At dawn, I opened the hatch. I brought 2-gallon jugs of water and set them at the base of the split white oak, visible from the turnaround, but not from the road. Then I went back down and sealed the hatch and waited. It took 4 hours. I heard them return. I heard the footsteps approach the oak. A pause. The sound of plastic being lifted. "Christ," the male voice said. Quietly, not to me, to the water. "There's 2, the female voice said. "1 each." Another pause. Then the male voice, directed upward, into the trees, into the ground, not knowing where I was. "Thank you. We'll be back on the road. We won't come again unless you want us to. If you want us to come back, leave something at the tree." Footsteps retreating. Logging road. Gone. I sat on the floor of the shelter and did the math. 2 gallons. That was 2 days of my water supply. Against 410 remaining days, it was nothing. Against the principle that every resource shared reduced my survival timeline, it was the first breach. My grandfather's letter sat on the desk. "I am not telling you to refuse people. I am telling you to count." I was counting. 2 gallons, 2 strangers. One decision that cracked the seal he'd spent 15 years perfecting. I left a can of peaches at the tree. They came back the next morning. This time, I was above ground, sitting in the gap of the white oak with the hatch closed beneath me and the forest floor undisturbed. I saw them before they saw me. The man was late 20s, tall, thin to the point of structural concern, wearing a backpack that had been duct-taped at one shoulder strap, brown hair matted with trail dirt. His hands were empty. He walked with the deliberate foot placement of someone who had learned recently that noise carried consequences. The woman was older, 35 maybe, shorter, compact, with a medical ID badge still clipped to her jacket, which was the kind of fleece hospitals give to staff who work overnight shifts. She carried a child's backpack with cartoon elephants on it, obviously not hers, obviously chosen for capacity rather than appearance. They found the peaches. The man picked up the can and turned it over once in his hands and looked at the trees, not searching, offering his face, letting whoever was watching see him. "I'm Nolan," he said to the forest. "This is June. We were in Durban when it fell apart. She was at the clinic there. I was driving through for work. We've been walking 4 days. June. The medical badge. Durban. The town the man at the roadblock said was gone. We're headed for the National Radio Quiet Zone boundary," Nolan continued. "There's a rumor there's military staging at Green Bank. If we keep going and you never see us again, that's fine. But if you have information, or if you need something we can provide, we're here." He set the empty peach can back on the oak's root flare, upside down like a marker. They turned and walked back down the logging road. I watched them disappear. Then I climbed down into the shelter and opened the binder to a section I hadn't read carefully enough. Page 71. Communication. Near the bottom, a paragraph I had skimmed. "Green Bank is 26 miles north. If any federal facility survives in this region, it will be there. Because it is already hardened, already staffed, already off the grid." I could not verify this, but the logic holds. If you need to move, move toward the dish. My grandfather had known about Green Bank. He'd built the shelter within a day's hard walk of it, not because the shelter was the end, because it was the start. I made the decision at sunrise on day 11, not through logic, through the accumulated weight of 2 nights spent rereading my grandfather's letter and finding in it something I had not wanted to see the first time. I'm sorry I was not easier to know. He hadn't been easy to know because he did everything alone. He dug the shelter alone. He stocked it alone. He drove to Pocahontas County alone and carried concrete mix up a logging road alone and installed a ventilation system alone in a hole in a mountain that no one would ever see until he was dead. He did all of this because he loved me, and he did not trust anyone else to help him love me. And the result was that I had a perfect shelter and a dead grandfather, and no one to tell me whether the loneliness of this place was a feature or a flaw. He'd written count. He hadn't written refuse. I surfaced at dawn. I left the hatch open. I walked down the logging road to the turnaround where my car sat with its windows fogging in the morning cold, and I kept walking. The logging road met 219 at the Cedar Post, and I turned north, and I walked 2 miles before I found them. They'd camped in a drainage culvert under the highway. Not ideal, but defensible in a limited way. Nolan was sitting at the culvert's opening with a chunk of sandstone he was sharpening a pocket knife against. June was inside, head on the elephant backpack, asleep or close to it. Nolan saw me and went still. His hand stopped on the knife. He looked at me with an expression I will try to describe accurately. It was not hope. It was the thing before hope. The readiness to be disappointed that has not yet been disappointed. "You left the water," he said. "Yes. And the peaches." "Yes." He set the knife down. Not performatively, just releasing it, the way you release something you no longer need to hold. "How far is your shelter?" he asked. 2 miles south." "How long can it sustain 3 people?" He asked the question I would have asked. The math question. The question that acknowledged the cost before requesting the gift. My grandfather would have recognized this man, and I knew it with a certainty I could not explain. 5 months, I said. Maybe 6 with supplemental foraging? He nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He turned to the culvert and said, "June, wake up. She's here." June emerged. Her fleece was damp and her face carried that particular gray of someone who has not eaten enough for too many days. But her eyes were clear and focused, and she looked at me with the professional assessment of a clinician, not the gratitude of a supplicant. She was reading me the way I imagined she'd read patients. Skin color, posture, coherence of speech, nutritional status. I was being triaged, and I didn't mind it. "I'm Elise," I said. "June Whitaker. I was a nurse practitioner at Pocahontas Memorial. It's gone." Flat delivery. Information, not emotion. She'd processed the loss already or locked it somewhere she could process it later. "Nolan tells me you have a water source and a structure. My grandfather built it." "Is he there?" "He's dead. He left me a map." Something moved across her face. Not pity. Something closer to clinical interest in the structure of the sentence I'd just spoken. A dead man's map leading to a living woman's survival. She nodded once, and that was the end of the intake interview. We walked back. I led them up the logging road and into the turnaround, and to the split white oak. And when I cleared the leaf litter from the hatch and opened it, Nolan looked into the shaft and then looked at me and said the only thing that mattered. "He built this alone?" 15 years. Nolan crouched at the edge of the shaft and touched the concrete sleeve with his fingertips. His face did something I hadn't expected. It broke. Just for a second. A man who had been holding himself together with careful questions and deliberate footsteps, suddenly losing the grip because someone else's careful, deliberate work was visible in poured concrete. He understood what it had cost. He understood it in a way that I, who had received it, was only beginning to. "Okay," he said. He stood up and wiped his face with his sleeve, and the composure returned. "Let me get June. We'll need to recalculate everything." June recalculated everything. She was better at it than I was. Within 2 hours of entering the shelter, she had the binder open to the caloric section and a pencil working numbers on the blank pages my grandfather had left at the back. And she informed me, without apology or softening, that 3 people at 1,800 calories per day dropped the food supply from 14 months to 4 months in 20 days. Your grandfather's ratios are exact, she said. He didn't pad them. There's no margin built in because he designed for one person at maintenance level. 3 people at the same level triples the burn rate. I know, I said. Do you know what 4 months and 20 days means? It means we run out in late February. That's deep winter in this elevation. Foraging is 0. Creek may be running, but caloric deficit kills before dehydration does. I knew that too. I'd run the numbers the morning I left the water at the tree. I had done the thing my grandfather told me to do. I had counted. And the count said this was a bad decision, and I had made it anyway. So we supplement, Nolan said. He'd been cataloging the tool shelf with the focus of someone who'd been hungry long enough to understand that inventory was hope. There are houses between here and the highway. I passed 4 on the way in, all abandoned. None of them looted, at least not thoroughly. You want to scavenge, June said. I want to extend the timeline. This became the framework. Nolan would surface, scout, and retrieve. June would manage the shelter systems and medical readiness. I would maintain the schedule, the count, and the binder. 3 people with 3 functions, organized around a dead man's arithmetic, trying to stretch his gift across more lives than it was cut for. Nolan's first surface run happened on day 13. He left at first light and returned 4 hours later with a case of canned soup, 2 bottles of bleach, and a sleeping bag he'd pulled from a house a mile and a half down, 219. No contact with the infected. No contact with anyone. His second run, day 15, was different. He came back with food, but also information. There were tracks on 219. Vehicle tracks, recent, heading north. And at the junction where the Greenbrier Bridge crossed, the family with the roadblock was gone. The pickup was still there, angled across the road, but the people were not. One of the truck's windows was broken from the outside. There was blood on the gravel shoulder. Not a lot. Enough. Something came through, Nolan said. He stood at the base of the ladder, breathing hard from the descent, his face carrying a color I hadn't seen on him before. Not infected. Vehicles, more than one. People, June said. People with vehicles, and a reason to break through a roadblock instead of talking to it. We sat with that information the way you sit with a diagnosis. The shelter's primary defense was invisibility. But my car was still in the turnaround, and the logging road was still accessible from the highway, and the cedar post my grandfather had placed to mark the turn was still standing at the junction for anyone careful enough to notice. The car has to go, I said. Nolan nodded. And the post. I hesitated. The post was my grandfather's. It was part of the map. It was the marker that had brought me here. Removing it felt like erasing a sentence from the last letter a dead man would ever write. Elise, June said. Her voice carried neither sympathy nor impatience. Only the tone of someone who had delivered hard medical truths enough times to know that delay worsened the prognosis. The post is the map. Anyone who finds it follows it. You know this. I knew this. I went up with Nolan at dusk. He drove my car to the pull-off at mile marker 6, the way my grandfather's binder had instructed. And I pulled the cedar post from the ground with both hands and carried it into the tree line and laid it in the creek where the current would weather away the notch. We walked back in darkness, Nolan navigating by memory, me navigating by the absence of anything else to follow. When we reached the turnaround, there was no car, no post, no sign. The logging road was just a logging road. The mountain had swallowed us back. I sealed the hatch and sat at the desk and opened the binder to the page on security. My grandfather's handwriting. Invisibility is your primary weapon. I had just dismantled part of the map he'd built me in order to protect what the map led to. This felt like a paradox. It also felt like the first decision I had made, not by following his instructions, but by understanding the principle beneath them. Nolan found the second map on day 19. He was reorganizing the tool shelf, a task he'd taken on with the quiet compulsion of a man who managed anxiety through inventory. When he moved the waterproof bin of field manuals and found a false bottom. Beneath it, a rolled tube of drafting paper sealed in a PVC pipe section capped at both ends. He brought it to me. I opened it at the desk with June watching from the sleeping platform we'd built against the far wall. Inside the PVC tube was a second topographic map, same USGS Quad Series, but covering a wider area. Pocahontas County, Randolph County, and the eastern edge of the National Radio Quiet Zone. My grandfather's annotations covered it in green ink this time, different from the blue of the first map, as though he'd drawn them in a different season or a different state of mind. The shelter was marked. So was the logging road, the Cedar Post location, and the route from Charleston. But extending north from the shelter, a dotted green line traced a path through terrain I didn't recognize. It climbed the ridgeline behind the shelter, crossed two drainages, followed what appeared to be an old railroad grade, and terminated at a second X. This one was labeled differently. Site 7B, cash only, not habitable, restock and continue. Beyond that second X, the dotted line continued. It crossed the Greenbrier River at a point labeled Ford, summer only, climbed again, and passed through an area my grandfather had shaded in green pencil and labeled Quiet Zone Boundary. The line ended at a third X, larger, circled twice. Green Bank. If operational, present yourself. If not, return to Site 7. I stared at it. The room was quiet except for the ventilation and Diesel's steady breathing from his spot on the sleeping bag. He planned an exit route, Nolan said. More than that. June had come to stand behind me. She was reading the annotations with the careful attention she brought to everything. He planned a sequence. The shelter isn't the destination. It's the first position. The cache is the second. Green Bank is the third. She was right. My grandfather had not built me a bunker. He had built me a curriculum. The shelter was the first lesson. Stay alive, stay hidden, learn the count. The cache was the second. Move, resupply, extend your range. Green Bank was the third. Rejoin whatever structure remains, carrying what you've learned. He had anticipated that I would need to leave. He had built the leaving into the architecture. I thought about his letter. I am teaching you to survive, not to become someone who only survives. The second map changed the calculus. June's food projections showed us running dry in February. Green Bank, if it was operational, if it had the military presence the rumors described, represented a survival timeline without an end date. The cache at Site 7B, if it was stocked the way the shelter was stocked, could extend our supplies long enough to make the 26-mile trek during a window of manageable weather. November, June said. If we're going, November is the window. Before the snow line drops below 3,000 feet, after the deciduous canopy has thinned enough to see distance. Your grandfather knew that. Look at the route. It follows south-facing ridgelines. He picked them for November's sun exposure. I looked at the map again. She was right. Every segment of the route favored aspects that would receive maximum autumn sunlight. He'd planned the season. He'd planned the pace. He'd planned me reading this map with enough shelter time behind me to understand what it meant, and enough time pressure ahead of me to understand that staying was not a permanent option. There's something else, Nolan said. He was pointing at a notation near Site 7B. Small handwriting in the margin, easy to miss. Elise, if you are reading this with others, you are doing the right thing. I built for one. You will build for more. That is not a flaw in my design. It is the flaw I could not fix in myself. I sat with my palms pressed flat against the desk the way I had on the first night. But this time, I was not crying. I was thinking about a man who understood that his greatest limitation was solitude, who knew it well enough to name it, and who could not overcome it. And so instead built a structure that would carry his granddaughter to the point where she could overcome it for him. The shelter was not the gift. The map was not the gift. The gift was the permission to leave, embedded in the architecture of staying. We prepared for 16 days. Nolan scouted the first 3 miles of the route on day 20 and returned with detailed notes on terrain, water sources, and 2 sightings that changed our understanding of the threat. The first was a group of infected at the bottom of the drainage northwest of the shelter, 6 of them standing in the creek bed in waist-deep water, motionless, facing upstream. They were not drinking. They were not moving. They were standing in cold mountain water with their arms at their sides, and their faces tilted slightly upward as though listening to something carried in the current. I watched them for 20 minutes, Nolan said. None of them moved. Not a step, not a twitch. It was like they'd been turned off. Or they're in some kind of dormancy cycle, June said. She'd been the one to first suggest, on day 14, that the infected were not constant in their behavior. She'd observed from the hatch a solitary figure crossing the turnaround at night, moving slowly, its coordination degraded from what I'd seen in Charleston. She hypothesized that the infection had a metabolic arc, active phase, decline phase, possibly a terminal phase. She lacked data, but she watched. The second sighting was worse. At the ridgeline, where the route crossed an exposed saddle, Nolan found evidence of a recent camp. Not infected, human, fire ring, boot prints, food wrappers from military MRE packages, and, driven into a tree at eye height, a nail with a strip of orange surveyor's tape tied to it. Marking a route, June said. Or marking territory, Nolan said. We didn't know. We couldn't know. But the orange tape meant that someone with organized supply and the capacity to move through this terrain had been on our ridgeline within the last week, the same ridgeline my grandfather's route followed north. This produced the first serious argument. Nolan wanted to adjust the route, swing east, avoid the saddle, add distance, but reduce exposure. I wanted to follow my grandfather's path because it was calibrated to the terrain, and I trusted his judgment, even in death. June listened to both of us and said nothing until we ran out of words. The question isn't which route is safer, she said. The question is what we do if we meet them. It was the question I had been avoiding since the roadblock. The family on the highway was gone, their truck breached by someone with vehicles and force, and we were 3 unarmed people following a dead man's map through mountains, occupied by an unknown number of groups with unknown intentions. And my grandfather's protocol for this situation was avoid, which assumed you could. If they're military, Nolan said, they might be staging toward Green Bank. Same direction, same logic. If they're military, the MRE wrappers make sense. If they're not military, the MRE wrappers mean they took them from someone who was. June delivered this observation the way she delivered all her observations. As data. No inflation. No softening. Just the differential diagnosis of a surveyor's tape on a nail in a tree. We modified the route. Nolan's adjustment added 4 miles, but kept us below the ridgeline for the exposed section, using the old railroad grade my grandfather had marked, but hadn't chosen as his primary path. We would cross the saddle at a lower elevation, accept denser forest, and reduced visibility in exchange for reduced exposure. My grandfather might have made the same decision. Or he might have walked the ridgeline with the confidence of a man who'd spent 50 years trusting his own assessment. I would not know. I was learning to trust mine. We packed on day 34. Each of us carried a framed pack assembled from the shelter's supplies. Nolan took tools, rope, and the hatchet. June took the medical kit and the water filtration system. I took the red binder, both maps, the hand crank radio, and food for 8 days at reduced rations. I left the shelter stocked with what remained. 14 days of food, 60 gallons of water, the sleeping bag, the camp stove. I left the hatch unlocked. I left a note on the desk, written in block letters because my grandfather had taught me to letter clearly, weighted down with a can opener. This shelter was built by Russell Dean Mercer, 2004 to 2019. It is stocked for one person for 14 days. Take what you need. Seal the hatch when you leave. If you are heading to Greenbank, the route is marked on the map on the wall. I pinned the first map, the one that had brought me from Charleston, to the corkboard next to our photograph. Anyone who found this place would find the path forward, the way I had found it, because a man who couldn't stop building for one person had left enough room in the architecture for a stranger. I sealed the hatch from outside. I covered it with leaf litter and moss. I stood in the gap of the white oak and looked down at the ground and saw nothing. The mountain had taken its secret back. We walked north. The cache at Site 7B was exactly where the map placed it. A buried 55-gallon drum in a shallow depression along the old railroad grade, marked by 3 stones stacked vertically that looked natural unless you'd been told to look for them. Nolan dug it out with the hatchet, while June and I maintained a perimeter that consisted of standing back to back and listening to the forest with the sustained attention of people for whom sound had replaced sight as the primary survival sense. Inside the drum, 12 cans of food, 2 gallons of sealed water, an emergency bivouac tarp, a fixed blade knife in a leather sheath, 50 feet of paracord, and a third envelope with my name on it. I opened it sitting on the railroad grade with my back against a sourwood tree and my pack between my knees. The handwriting was less steady. He'd written this one later, maybe last. Elise, you left the shelter? Good. I hoped you would and feared you wouldn't. The knife is your great-uncle Paul's from Korea. You've held it before. You were 6. You told me it was heavy. It is. That's the point. Weight is how you know something is real. From here to Greenbank, the terrain opens. You will be visible on the high ground and slow in the valleys. Choose the valleys. You are not a ridge runner. You are a person who listens and moves carefully, and that is sufficient for everything except pride. If Greenbank is gone, go back to the shelter and wait for winter to end and then go south. Do not go north of the quiet zone. Do not go east into the Shenandoah. Go south along the Greenbrier until you reach a town. You will find people. You are good at finding people. You just don't know it yet. I did not build the shelter because I thought the world would end. I built it because I thought you would need a place, to discover that you could leave one. This is the last letter. There are no more caches. From here, you carry what you are. That was always enough. I was just too poor at saying it to say it any other way than concrete. I folded the letter and put it in my jacket against my chest. Nolan and June waited without asking what it said. They had learned in 34 days underground with me that my grandfather communicated through architecture and that his letters were load-bearing structures I needed to receive privately before I could stand on them publicly. We divided the cache and continued north. The terrain opened the way he'd said it would. The railroad grade petered out after 2 miles, and we descended into a long valley following a creek that ran clear and fast over limestone. The canopy was thin. November light came through in long, angular columns that made the forest floor glow amber. It was the most beautiful walking I'd ever done, and I was terrified the entire time. At the valley's midpoint, June stopped. She held up one hand. We froze. Ahead, where the creek bent around a boulder field, something was sitting in the water. Not standing the way Nolan had described the dormant group. Sitting, legs extended, back against a rock, submerged to the waist. A woman, or what had been a woman. Her head was tilted back, and her mouth was open, and the water ran through her lap and over her hands, and she did not move. "Is she dead?" I whispered. June studied her for a long time. "I don't think so. Look at her hands." I looked. The fingers were moving, not with purpose. A slow, rhythmic flexion, like someone playing a piano in a dream. The water ran between them, and the fingers opened and closed, and the rest of the body was still. "Metabolic decline," June said. "Late stage. She's not a threat." We gave her a wide berth, 40 feet. As we passed, the woman's head rolled slightly toward us, and her eyes were open, and they tracked our movement the way a sunflower tracks light. Slow, continuous, without volition. Whatever she had been was mostly gone. Whatever remained was just enough to follow motion. I did not look back. But I heard, for another 100 yards, the sound of the creek running over a body that was still technically alive. And I carried that sound like a frequency I could not tune out. We saw the dish from the ridgeline above Deer Creek on the afternoon of the third day out. The Robert C. Byrd Greenbank Telescope, the largest fully steerable radio telescope in the world, rising from the valley floor like a white geometric moon tethered to the earth. Even from 4 miles away, it dominated the landscape with a precision that felt intentional, as though someone had placed it there to prove that human engineering could match the scale of the mountains. Nolan stopped walking. June stopped beside him. I stood behind them both, breathing hard from the climb, and looked at the dish and felt a sensation I want to describe precisely. It was not hope. It was recognition. The recognition that my grandfather had aimed me at something real. The facility was intact. I could see structures around the telescope's base, buildings, a parking area, fencing, movement. Small at this distance, indeterminate, but movement. Living human beings operating within a perimeter. My hand-crank radio had picked up nothing on the approach, but the National Radio Quiet Zone suppressed most transmissions by design. And my grandfather had noted this. Do not expect radio contact inside the zone. Listen for vehicle engines and generator hum instead. I could hear generators, a low, steady pulse beneath the wind, power being made. "There's a gate," Nolan said. He had better distance vision than either of us. Chain link with additions, concertina wire on top, and a vehicle. Looks like a Humvee parked outside it. Military presence. The rumors were true, or at least partially true. Someone with federal resources had decided the Greenbank facility was worth holding, which made sense for reasons my grandfather had not explained, but June had worked out during our second night walking. The telescope's receivers, tuned to detect signals from deep space, could be repurposed to detect electromagnetic emissions from anywhere on the continent. In a world without functioning communication infrastructure, the facility that could listen to the entire sky was the most valuable piece of equipment in North America. We descended from the ridge carefully. The approach was open meadow for the last half-mile, which meant visibility in both directions. We stopped at the tree line and waited. At 4:15, a patrol emerged from the gate. Two figures in military utility uniforms, armed, walking a perimeter path that took them along the eastern fence line. They moved with the professional boredom of people who had been doing this long enough for it to become routine. That boredom was more reassuring than any sign could have been. It meant time. It meant stability. It meant that they had been here long enough for guard duty to become a chore. "How do we approach?" Nolan asked. "Openly," June said. "Hands visible, slow. If they're organized enough for patrols, they're organized enough for intake protocols." She was right. And she was the one who should lead the approach, because she was a medical professional carrying credentials. And in a world where institutions had collapsed, a nurse practitioner was not a refugee. She was a resource. I thought about this as we stepped into the meadow. My grandfather had sent me here carrying nothing but his letters and his maps, and 26 years of being the person behind the desk that no one looked at twice. Nolan brought scouting skill and mechanical aptitude. June brought clinical training and the capacity to assess, diagnose, and treat. What did I bring? I brought the count. I knew, to the calorie and the gallon, what we had consumed and what we had left and what we had given away. I knew the arithmetic of the shelter and the cash, and the 3 bodies that had moved through this landscape for 3 days on reduced rations. And I knew it because my grandfather had taught me that counting was not a small thing. It was the discipline that kept generosity from becoming suicide and caution from becoming cruelty. The patrol saw us at 200 yards. One of them raised a hand, not a weapon, a hand. The universal signal, stop. We stopped, hands visible. 3 people in a meadow below a radio telescope, dirty and tired, and carrying packs assembled from a dead man's provisions, waiting for permission to rejoin the species. The soldier approached. Young, maybe my age. He looked at June's badge, at Nolan's empty hands, at me holding nothing but a folded map and a red binder. "How many?" he asked. 3, I said. "Where from?" "A shelter in Pocahontas County. My grandfather built it." He looked at me. Something in his expression shifted. Not suspicion. Something closer to weariness that hadn't quite become indifference. The face of a person who had processed enough arrivals to have lost surprise, but not enough to have lost attention. "We'll need to quarantine you for 72 hours, he said. "Standard intake, medical screen, interview, skills assessment." He looked at the binder in my hands. "What's that?" "Logistics," I said. "Inventory management, supply calculation." He almost smiled. "We need that more than you know. Follow me." The quarantine was a converted equipment storage building near the telescope's base. 3 cots, a chemical toilet, bottled water, and MREs. A guard outside, not hostile, just present. 72 hours of observation to confirm we weren't infected, weren't hostile, and weren't lying about who we were. June used the time to sleep for the first 14 hours straight, which was the first time I'd seen her fully surrender to exhaustion. Nolan inventoried our remaining supplies out of habit, then sat on his cot and stared at the ceiling with the particular blankness of a man who had been moving for so long that stillness felt like falling. I sat at a folding table and opened the red binder. I turned past the shelter protocols, past the food calculations, past the security section and the communication section and the mental health section, to the blank pages at the back. The ones June had used for her recalculations. The ones still clean. I started a new section. I wrote the heading in block letters the way my grandfather had taught me. Transit log, Site 7 to Green Bank. And beneath it, I recorded everything. The dates, the distances, the caloric expenditure per day, the water consumption, the resupply from the cache, the terrain conditions, the infected sightings, the evidence of other human movement. I recorded the orange surveyor's tape and the abandoned roadblock. And the woman in the creek, whose fingers moved like a pianist's. I recorded what we'd carried, what we'd left, and what we'd given away. I recorded the names: Nolan, June, Elise. 3 people, 8 days, alive. It took me 4 hours. When I finished, the binder was no longer my grandfather's document. It was ours. His protocols on the front end, our data on the back end, connected by the spine of a 3-ring binder he'd bought at an office supply store in Beckley sometime in the last 15 years. Probably on a Tuesday. Probably on his way to the hospice for another treatment he knew wouldn't work. On the second day, a woman in civilian clothes with a military escort came to interview us. She was in her 50s, gray-haired, with the composed bearing of someone who had been managing complex systems before the collapse, and had simply continued doing so with a different resource base. She introduced herself as Dr. Catherine Voss, the facility's interim coordinator. She interviewed June first. It took 90 minutes. June emerged and said only, "They need medical staff, badly." She'd been assigned to the clinic before her quarantine was technically complete. She interviewed Nolan second. 40 minutes. He was assigned to perimeter maintenance and scouting operations, a role that used exactly the skills he'd demonstrated on our transit and nothing more. My interview was different. Dr. Voss sat across from me at the folding table and looked at the red binder, which I'd placed between us. "The soldier mentioned you carried a logistics document." My grandfather wrote it. The first half is shelter management protocols. The second half is a transit log I maintained during our 3-day movement from the shelter to this facility. "May I?" I pushed it across the table. She read for 20 minutes, not skimming, reading. I watched her eyes move through my grandfather's calculations, his contingency branches, his annotations about caloric load and water dependency, and the mathematics of sharing. She turned to my section and read the transit log with the same attention. When she finished, she closed the binder and placed both hands flat on its cover. "Who taught you to record like this?" "He did, by example. I didn't know I'd learned it until I needed to. We have 47 people here. We have a functioning power source, water, a defensible perimeter, and the most sensitive listening equipment in the Western Hemisphere. What we do not have is anyone who thinks about logistics the way this binder thinks about logistics. We have soldiers who count ammunition and scientists who count data points, and no one who counts the distance between what we have and what we need the way your grandfather counted it." She pushed the binder back across the table. "I'd like you to build us one of these. For the facility, every resource, every consumption rate, every timeline. Can you do that?" I looked at the binder. My grandfather's handwriting on the cover, just my name. Written in the same block letters he'd used on the envelope, the map annotations, the letters, and every careful measurement he'd left behind. "Yes," I said. Not because I was confident, because he had been confident for me. And somewhere between the shelter and the dish, I'd begun to understand that his confidence was not projection. It was observation. He had watched me for 26 years and seen something precise. And I could either believe him or continue to believe the version of myself that worked the front desk and adjusted pool temperatures and smiled for people who forgot my face. I chose him. The binder grew. It became the facility's central resource document, updated daily, referenced in every allocation meeting and every intake decision. When new survivors arrived, I processed them the way June had processed me in the culvert. Assessment, inventory, integration. I counted everything. Food, water, fuel, people, days. The count was not cold. The count was the opposite of cold. The count was the practice of taking each person seriously enough to measure what they needed and what they carried, and where the two intersected. Nolan ran the trails. June ran the clinic. I ran the numbers. 3 people a dead man's map had assembled, each doing the thing his architecture had positioned them to do. At night, sometimes, I opened the binder to the back page, where his last letter lived in a plastic sleeve. You will find people. You are good at finding people. You just don't know it yet. I was not a builder. I was not a fighter. I was not a leader. I was the woman who counted, who kept the record, who held the distance between what we had and what we needed in her head, like a frequency only she could hear. He had known. He had always known. And because he could not say it, he poured it into concrete and folded it into maps and left it in envelopes for me to find after he was gone. Each one a sentence in a language he had invented because the one we shared was not precise enough for what he felt. I carry the knife. I carry the binder. I carry the letters. I carry him.